Hello, my friends. I hope everyone is doing well today. Topical. I was just thinking about this earlier. Polyvagal theory. Wow. I have a lot to say about polyvagal theory. So much, in fact, that I wrote a rather lengthy blog article, paper, whatever, about polyvagal theory. It is on my website. I will link it. It's probably the piece of writing that I am most proud of that I've ever done, so take that for what you will. For those of you who haven't heard of polyvagal theory, I won't go into everything that I talked about in that article in this video. I'll try to just give like a high-level overview of why I think this is kind of like a flashpoint of like alternative mind-body medicine and why I think it's important. So polyvagal theory is a theory that was espoused by Stephen Porges, who is a psychologist, basically. And he has done a lot of research over the course of his career using heart rate variability as a metric for measuring the effects of different interventions. And again, he's been mostly in the field of like psychology, but with a focus on using like physiological markers for like looking at effects, which HRV is one such physiological marker. Please don't bark. So the theory, the new part of the theory, like the thing that this theory contributes that wasn't already contributed by other schools of thought, is the idea that, or the recognition that there are multiple different branches of the vagus nerve, which the vagus nerve starts in your brainstem and runs to a lot of your visceral organs, and it is the main component of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And a lot of people talk about the vagus nerve and vagal tone because it really does like kind of govern this parasympathetic rest and digest response. So typically having a more having good vagal tone is generally indicative of better health, because it means that your body is spending more time in a relaxed state rather than like a threatened defensive state. So the contribution of the polyvagal theory was to focus on the fact that the vagus nerve has two separate branches. One that, it has a dorsal branch and a ventral branch, and those are just like directional descriptors. Dorsal means like behind and ventral means in front. So that describes like the direction that the vagus nerve branches go. And you know, that is not like groundbreaking. That's basic anatomy. But the polyvagal theory proposes that these two branches originated at different stages in evolution, over the course of evolution, and that they have very different effects and play very different roles in the like stress response of, and like defensive modes, I guess, of the human nervous system. So everybody's probably heard of fight or flight and also freeze as a couple of different defensive nervous system states. And polyvagal theory proposes that, and as well as like the rest and digest relaxed stage. So polyvagal theory proposes that the ventral branch of the vagus nerve is intertwined with all of the cranial nerves and other nerves that govern all of our activities of like social engagement, which, you know, is true. He kind of talks about it in like a weird way, as though like he'll kind of conflate the term like ventral vagus as though that's referring to this whole system, when it's not. Like they're different nerves. But it is true that a lot of these nerves work together on various body processes involved in social engagement, like facial expression and vocalization and like turning of the head and whatever. So yeah, he calls the ventral vagus the smart vagus or the mammalian vagus, because I forgot to cover that part, the evolution thing. This is a huge part of polyvagal theory, which is part of why I take issue with it. You'll see polyvagal theory talked about like all over the place in like trauma healing Instagram and trauma healing, like, you know, insert internet community here. And, you know, you kind of have to expect that there's going to be a little bit of a lack of scientific rigor in those kinds of like sound bite, trying to be like pretty and nice kind of content. But I did all of my research on the polyvagal theory just reading the literature, like actual papers published in scientific journals. And even there is so much narrativization of these branches of the vagus nerve. Like, he goes into this whole story about mammals versus reptiles and how the dorsal branch of the vagus evolved during the reptilian age of evolution, and that, you know, explains things about how reptiles respond to threat and they like freeze and whatever. Like, I don't want to, I'm straw manning him a little bit. Obviously this is like a short video without, you know, actively having references to show you. The Steel Man is in my article, so if you want that, go look at it. But it is very obvious that there's like some storytelling going on, which should always be a clue that scientific rigor might be being sacrificed a little bit. So yeah, the dorsal vagus he refers to as like the reptilian vagus, and basically saying that the role that it currently plays in humans is still a holdover from those early reptilian adaptive protective mechanisms. And the very first polyvagal theory focused in on the phenomenon of bradycardia in like infants, or even fetuses. I can't remember which it was. I would have to go look again. But there's this like phenomenon where you would have dramatically decreased heart rate in concert with really low heart rate variability, I believe. I think I'm getting that right. And this was significant because the ventral vagus is responsible for, or the vagus in general, if you don't like tease apart the different branches, is theoretically functions both to slow the heart rate and increase heart rate variability. So to see those things diverge in dramatically different directions in this specific clinical phenomenon was noteworthy, which, yes, it is noteworthy. And that's kind of what spawned the whole polyvagal theory. The very first polyvagal theory paper is incredibly interesting, and I thought it was a great read. Read it if you're interested. The problem is that, like, after he published this paper and started, like, popularizing the theory, different experts in, like, autonomic nervous system physiology and also evolutionary biology chimed in to be like, hey, the things that you're saying about the comparative evolution of reptiles versus mammals, and also the things that you're claiming about the nervous system, are, like, not really aligned with current scientific understanding. And rather than engaging with those critiques and kind of, like, trying to find a common ground and maybe, like, modifying the theory, as far as I can tell, he has just kind of, like, plowed on ahead and just really leaned into the storytelling and the basically symbolism of reptile versus mammal, smart vagus versus, I don't think he ever says dumb vagus, reptilian vagus. And it has just like, it's been repeated so many times at this point that people just take it as a given, take it as a truth, and then, like, propagate it as a truth, which is incredibly annoying to me, but happens all the time. And the thing that bothers me the most about the polyvagal theory situation is that the specific evolutionary and anatomical and physiological claims of the polyvagal theory are not necessary to support what polyvagal theory is actually being used for. Because what polyvagal theory is actually being used for is as a framework through which to understand both human, human defensive states and threat response states, which again would be kind of the large buckets of fight or flight, freeze, shut down. Fawn is in there, but not really talked about that much with polyvagal theory. So yeah, like a framework through which to understand those states, and also as basically like a mechanistic justification to explain how mind and body are interlinked, and how things like trauma can adversely impact your physical health and vice versa. Those things can be true. Like, you can use a high-level abstract framework made up of concepts and categories and labels without needing to justify it through evolution or through a specific physiological mechanism. And likewise, you can recognize it as pretty incontrovertibly true that mind and body are extremely linked when it comes to trauma, when it comes to chronic illness, et cetera, again, without, like, that can be true regardless of what the mechanism is there. So, like, people get very obsessed with polyvagal theory and very attached to it and very defensive of it because they perceive it as like explaining and justifying their experiences. And often they're very difficult experiences. And we like having explanations and justifications for our experiences, especially experiences that are difficult. And especially when you are talking about health, like it is true, unfortunately, that like the medical system, doctors, whatever, will often not take you seriously or not take treatment modalities seriously or not take, I don't know, symptoms seriously if there's not like a firm mechanistic explanation for how everything works. And that's not good. That's really a disservice to patients. But it is also an enormous, huge disservice to patients and science and like medical and scientific progress to have this like pseudoscience-y, nice sounding but probably BS mechanistic explanation, framework, theory that is like being put forth as like, take it seriously because of this, like take it seriously because nerves and nervous system and evolution and like those things. You like evolution, you like anatomy, like you'll believe me when I, you know, maybe you won't believe me if I say that I'm feeling XYZ way, but if I can say I'm feeling XYZ way because of my vagus nerve, then maybe you'll listen to me. Like, I get it. I understand the reasons why this theory has taken off so strongly and has become so entrenched in the chronic illness, trauma healing, et cetera, communities. Like, I get it, but it's not good. It is not good because the way that Porges and all of the people who propagate polyvagal theory are not treating it like a scientific theory. They're treating it like a myth that has, and this is like my thesis of my paper that I wrote, which I was very proud of, because like myth plays a very specific role in humans in general, but especially like specifically in healthcare, where like we have a psychological desire for like things making sense, for things like fitting together in specific ways that we find satisfying. And a myth can fill those needs without necessarily corresponding to reality, unfortunately. So I'm not saying that polyvagal theory doesn't have value in, you know, giving you a framework through which to think about experiences, but it's not scientific. And the more people act like it is, the more scientists and doctors will not take these communities seriously. And that is a big problem, because if we want to make any progress with medicine, with science, there needs to be actual rigorous scientific advancement that does hone in on the mechanisms involved in psychosomatic illness and in, you know, all of these things. And also, at the same time, there's still so much progress that people can make as individuals, as patients working with practitioners, without understanding the mechanism of anything. Like, so many people, like all of the people who will say that like they healed their trauma or they healed their chronic illness using polyvagal theory, it doesn't actually matter if polyvagal theory is like correct about the evolutionary history of the autonomic nervous system, because you're not actually like going in there and like fiddling with your nerves. You're using these like high level, very relational, very human therapies. Like, I don't know, whether it's journaling, whether it's different like exercises or massage techniques that stimulate different cranial nerves, including the vagus nerve. Like, all of these things do not depend on polyvagal theory to be effective and to be helpful. So yeah, I've talked about that for 21 minutes now, so I'll cut that off. But I will certainly be making more videos about this in the future. And yeah.